I'm George Curtis. Welcome to It's Your Law. Each week, it's my privilege to bring guests that teach all of us something that we wouldn't otherwise think about with regard to the making and the breaking and the enforcement and the development of our laws. It's the guests that make this show, and I want you to sit back for this one. This is a guest I've been trying to land here for 20 years. His name is Dave Tovar. Dave is a background of Spanish and Indian heritage. He's made a real impact on Wisconsin, on this particular area. His family has such an interesting history. It is America. Enough of the introduction. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hi, George.
I've been trying to get you on for 20 years, and you've been busy. You do lots of things. I understand you've been doing mostly research for the last 16 years.
Yes, research pretty much takes most of my time, 7 days a week, several hours a day, all year long.
Everybody's family has a history and a story, but yours has one of the most interesting stories I've heard. Where do you want to begin?
Well, I guess we should begin in Texas with my father. My father was born in Seguin, Texas in 1914. He was of Comanche and Hispanic heritage. Now that's important to the story because his heritage will come back to affect how things happened to him early in life. The story starts with his parents, grandparents, he and his brother living underneath one roof in Texas. Now, by all appearances, they were doing very well. But what happened was that by the age of 4, both of his parents had died. This left his grandparents to take care of him and his brother. But his grandparents had no means of support. So ultimately what happened was that the grandparents were forced to work on a ranch that was owned by a German farmer. Now, as laborers on this farm, in listening to my father describe their work and how they were paid, it sounds to me as though it was a debt peonage system, which, by the way, was illegal at the time. Now,
that means no rights to the worker. That means that the owners are in charge and they control what rewards for the labor, if any.
That's correct. That's correct. And in this case, my grandfather and grandmother, they worked an entire year, and at the end of that year, they only had $5 to show for their labor. The rest of the money, they were told, had been taken to repay the farmer for the food and supplies that he had given them. Now, they could have trapped, but the farmer owned the only gun in the area, and he was killing all of the animals in the surrounding area. To show you how poor they were, they had, for furniture, clay chairs that the grandfather and grandmother had collected from a local pond and formed into the shape of chairs.
Now, I know a little bit about your story, so I know that they escaped to Wisconsin. About what age were they when that happened?
Well, they would have been in their 20s. They had been married in 1937 in San Antonio, Texas, and this was during the Depression. But what happened was that my father was able to get a job in San Antonio, and he worked for the Works Project Administration. Then, as World War II came around, he was able to work for the War Department, and ultimately he worked for the Harvester Company in San Antonio, Texas, who produced war goods. But what happened, 1946 came around, and the veterans from World War II had returned and displaced not only him, but thousands of other Texans. This left him and my mother with no income. But some other circumstances happened that really caused them to pick up and move from Texas to Allenville.
How did they pick Allenville, Wisconsin as their next stop?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question because My father, when I actually asked him that question, he never really knew the answer to that. But what I have found in the interim is that there were recruiters that had been sent from the Midwest to Texas, and more specifically, they had been sent to San Antonio to try and recruit people to pick beets here in Wisconsin. And so there were recruiters in the area, and that's probably where he heard it from. But another interesting fact is that same year, 1946, is when the government of Mexico had decided that they were no longer going to let their Mexican nationals come to Wisconsin. The reason was because the low wages that were being offered for picking beets in Wisconsin, the housing was poor that was being offered to them, and also there was so much discrimination against them that the Mexican government decided not to let them come. So what happened was, and ironically, that my parents moved to Allenville and they moved into a labor camp that is called Little Mexico by the local people.
Now, who would have owned that labor camp?
The labor camp was owned by the Menominee Sugar Company. The railroads, in their quest for new avenues of money, had lost the lumbering industry and were looking for some new industry to take up as a source of income. So the Menominee Sugar Company built a beet dump in Allenville. The beet dump was meant to load the beets, weigh the beets, and then dump them into rail cars. Then what ended up happening was they knew they were going to hire people, so they had these one-room shacks built in Allenville for the migrant workers. Now, the migrant workers, including my parents, were living in these one-room shacks that had no electricity, had no indoor plumbing. They had 2 windows, 1 door, and they had a wood stove for heat and cooking. These were the same types of camps that the Mexican government had declined to have their own people live in.
So they jumped out of the kettle into the fire, apparently, but they were now in Wisconsin working as farm labor for not much money in poor living conditions. We're going to take a break while I think about that a little bit, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Law. I'm George Curtis, and my friend Dave Tovar is here, and we're talking about the Tovar family, although I think it had a different name at that time, and we're going to get into that. When we took our first break, we were getting up to the end of World War II. Tell us, what was the makeup of this family at the end of World War II, and what were they doing?
Well, our family consisted of mother, father, and 4 kids when we moved into the Little Mexico labor camp. Then between 1946 and 1954, our family traveled back and forth between Allenville and Texas. We would winter in Texas, where my dad would get a job working part-time seasonal jobs there, and then in the spring of each year, we would return to Allenville to work for the Menominee Sugar Company. We did this for several years, and in the meantime, of course, as we were traveling back and forth, the family kept increasing in size. My father, during this time also, was able to get a job with Wisconsin Axle Company, and he also worked for a local farmer by the name of Allen, John and Ted Allen. Harry actually owned the farm at the time, but he would work for them in exchange for meat and milk. Now, this went on in 1954. That was the first year that our family finally moved permanently to Allenville. By this time, my mother was in homemakers. The brothers and sisters were in the Winnie County School District. My older brothers, had even joined the Boy Scouts. Now, we were becoming well ingrained in the village at that time. And then in 1956, lucky for my dad, he was able to find a steady and good paying job.
Can I interrupt and ask a little bit about your acceptance in the community? Now, you folks were of Indian background and Spanish background. You were outsiders. I know a little bit about the care and treatment of crop workers in the Waushara County area. I represent a lot of them. What was your acceptance? Were there any barriers?
Well, there were a group of people that believe it or not, referred to the migrants as sheenies, greasers, and some even used the N-word. It was a small population, but it was also quite a vocal population, and I'm sure that that's some of the discrimination that the Mexican government had been complaining about. As far as the rest of the people in the community, because by that time we had joined the Allenville Baptist Church, we were involved in activities. There was a Grange Hall. We shopped at the local grocery store. The grocery store owner, Hazel and Chester Smith, across the street from us, or across the road from us, who owned the general store, were some of my mother's best friends. In fact, we spent each Christmas with them in their house. There was Halloween, trick-or-treating. The kids were involved with the neighborhood kids. And of course, the kids, they accepted us just as one of their own.
So you were comfortable in the schools, in the school system?
Well, we were all comfortable in the school systems, but remember, I'm one of the younger kids, and my older brothers and sisters had already set the stage for me by the time I entered school. You're talking a school, it's only a one-room school. It's 3 grades, and it's less than a mile up the road.
And before I interrupted you, I think you were explaining how the economics in the family were improving.
Yes. Well, what happened was in 1956 that my father ended up getting this good-paying job with Edie Chase Roofing Company here in Oshkosh. And you have to keep in mind that my father in 1949 had built a house. He had bought some property across the tracks from the Little Mexico. And on the property that he bought was an old blacksmith shop that had once been used for shoeing horses. Well, he deconstructed this building and he reconstructed it into a house for us. It was just a small structure, just a few rooms, no basement. Again, it was up on ties, and it had a wood stove. The loft, it looked like a barn, and what would be your hayloft was one single bedroom for the boys. It wasn't much of a house, but it was far better than what we had been living in, a one-room shack. So finally, in 1956, like I said, he finally gets this good job. And I think that my parents could see the light at the end of the tunnel. We finally probably had an opportunity where we were going to own a house, a nice house with a garage and a nice car. Unfortunately, the following year, my mother died. She died shortly after giving birth to my youngest sister. My father was in the hospital that day that she died. And along with him was the neighbor and my mother's best friend, Marcy Barkey. And as they're walking out of the hospital, my father and Marcy, my father turned to Marcy and asked her, what am I going to do with that baby? And without hesitation, Marcy said, I'll take her. And she did. She took Cookie, of course, her husband Pudge, and Marcy raised my sister Cookie as their own for 2 years until we were able to get back on our feet. But what happened shortly after that was that one of the neighbors caught wind that Marcy had been given this baby to care for, and she, wanting a baby of her own, decided to contact social services to intervene. Well, social services became involved, and it was decided that Marcy would keep my sister, but they also recommended, in fact, strongly, that 4 younger kids, including myself, were to be sent somewhere to be cared for. Well, lucky for us, the Hazel and Chester Smith were there to save us again. They decided that they would take us in and care for us. Now, by care, that means that during the daytime, when my father was gone to work, we would go to their house and they would watch us. At nighttime, when my father came home, they would drop us back off. Now, the social services never caught wind of that, but I'm fairly certain that they knew. You have to keep in mind that by this point in history, the Allenville Baptist Church is involved, and as is the Catholic Church where the Barkeys go to. And they were very strong, powerful organizations back then.
We're going to have to take a break. I'm getting a signal from Ron Bullock that you and I are talking too much. We'll be right back. Welcome back to It's Your Law. I'm George Curtis, and I'm having a conversation with Dave Tovar, and he's told us about Texas and told us about Allenville, and then off camera, while we were taking a break, he told me about Eureka, Wisconsin. I drive through that every morning and night. What's with Eureka?
Well, there was a movie that was filmed and actually premiered in 1957, the same year that my mother died. It premiered at the Ralph Theater here in Oshkosh. And the movie was a true story about a family in Eureka. It's a story about parents dying, leaving a number of children to fend for themselves. And the oldest sibling decides on Christmas Eve to take his brothers and sisters and walk from house to house, giving them away to the neighbors. This movie, I bring this up because I believe that was the impetus for an organization that began literally within a month or two of this movie premiere, and it was called the Dutch Uncles Club. Now, the Dutch Uncles Club was a organization that had decided that they were going to help any needy in Winnebago County. And our family was chosen as their first clients. Now, what they did was they sent some of their members over to our house, had discussions with my dad. They knew that we were a motherless family, and they decided to build us a new house. They had considered fixing up our old house, but keep in mind, our old house had no basement and it was very tiny. They ended up building us a house that was literally almost twice the size of the one we had been living in. Now you've got a father with 11 kids. Well, they completed that house in 1958. We moved in, and there was a big to-do in Allenville. With they invited people from across Wisconsin to come and view this house that they had built. Then, what I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention, though, that the people who started this organization were just local people, basically from Neenah. They had not only helped us in this acquiring a new home, they had gathered the resources of the church, the Allenville church, plumbers, contractors, from as far away as Milwaukee and Green Bay to donate not only food and material, but they even sewed our clothing. One Easter day, I remember when now I would have been very small, but yet it sticks in my mind that on Easter, the day before Easter, I believe, I walked into the front porch of our house, and there somebody anonymously during the night had dropped off baskets of food for our family. These kinds of things went on for the next several years until my father was finally able to get on his feet. In 1959, my father actually built a planter in front of the Allenville Baptist Church in memory of my mother. And that is the story of my family.
And all of you children were able to stay together with the courage of your father and your mother and the generosity of your neighbors.
Yes, that's correct. In fact, I would say we were able to thrive, if you consider the circumstances under which we lived.
And how are these children doing today?
Everyone everyone had a wonderful life. I would say that we all made it through the system. Everybody's fairly well happy. So I would say we all did very well.
Well, and of course you've had a career on the railroad, which usually means good income. And I think you've told me that you've spent the last 16 years learning, researching, and paying back to this great society. Tell us some of the things that you research.
Well, I have been concentrating on culturally modified trees for several years, and that is trees that were bent by Native Americans, and they, in actuality, they were spring pole traps. But today, if you look it up on Google it on the internet, they're called trail marker trees. I've also been interested recently in trying to gather data on diaries, journals, photographs of people in the area, whether it be Vinland, Clayton, anywhere in Winnebago County, any old photographs and types of information I can collect.
And you were close to the Allen family. You've mentioned them. You and I share a friend, John Allen, who recently passed away. I remember talking to you a couple of times at the YMCA that you had to leave early because you were taking John down to get medical attention. I knew him because I was his campaign manager on 3 or 4 unsuccessful attempts to be elected to public office, but you were right in the middle of that. You were an American, a citizen, and while you had some extra challenges because you weren't the standard German that is in every third farm in this area of Wisconsin, you and your parents and your siblings made it work. You came out of it strong, accepted, respected, successful, and you're ready for the next generation, aren't you?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, well, at least I hope that we at least set an example for those who followed us.
We're in a different America today, and what is your view of what Americans should be doing to be a welcoming, melting pot that I think, and I know you think, has made this nation great?
Well, I think what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to weave a common thread through all of us. And by a common thread, I mean the type of connections that our family ended up having in the community of Allenville. It was a thread that ran through the church. It ran through the local farmers, through the stores, through your neighbors, through your local organizations, and it tied us all together in a way that I suppose that we probably weren't even aware of, that this thread was weaving. What we lack today is that thread that's going to keep us all connected. We can't see the connection between not only ourselves and our neighbors, but we have a difficult time trying to see the thread that weaves us to other countries, to other cultures.
Well, Dave, I thank you so much for being on the show and for your courage and your family's courage of fighting the fight and making the American dream a reality. I congratulate you.
Thank you.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. The greatness of America is founded on hard, honest work, with a little boost from kind people along the way. Regardless of color, regardless of whether you were immigrants like my family coming from Germany, or whether you were here before like Indian people, we're all Americans, and we have a responsibility to be Americans and boost each other to be the best that we can. I'm George Curtis, and that's my opinion.